The broadcast is now starting. All attendees are in listen-only mode.
Hello, everyone, and welcome to the monthly Psych Central webinar series. We're glad to have you here. Please save all of your questions until the end. However, you are welcome to type them in whenever you want. Remember, we cannot see you, so raising your hands or yelling at the screen will not be effective. Thank you so much, and I present our presenter.
Thanks so much, Gabe. All right. Hi, guys. Thanks so much for being with me today. We're going to talk about the 8 signs of intergenerational trauma. And this has been something that a lot of my clients come to see me for. And we talk about 8 specific signs that there has been some kind of trauma in your family. But before we get to what we're going to cover today, I want to give you just a little bit of background on me. I am a state licensed and internationally certified mental health trauma therapist. I have about 11 to 12 years experience in the field, and I do a lot of work in the field on adolescent suicide and adult trauma, as well as general mental health issues as it relates to childhood trauma. So what I will do is, hopefully you guys can hear me. If you can't, please let me know, Gabe.
You are coming through loud
and
clear.
Oh, awesome. Thank you, Gabe. All right. So I'm going to stop looking at the screen over here because it's making me a little anxious. But so let's go ahead and jump on in. What I'll do is I'll give you my website. It's www.anchoredinKnowledge.com, and you can find out a little bit more about me there. All right, so let's go ahead and get started. So what we'll cover in this webinar presentation, we're going to do a basic definition of what intergenerational trauma is. We're also going to discuss, obviously, those 8 common signs. We're going to mention just a little bit of cultural considerations, because intergenerational trauma does affect people from all walks of life, but it does affect people with a history of marginalization. So we'll touch on that just a little bit at the end, and then we'll also talk about post-traumatic growth. All right, so what is intergenerational trauma? There's a variety of definitions of what intergenerational trauma is. I tend to define it as something that has happened over the course of one's family history. So something may have happened with a great-grandparent, something may have happened with a great uncle or a great aunt, and it just transferred throughout generations. So I'll give you an example of this. Let's say in your family, your great-great-grandmother had a history of psychological and physical abuse. What happens in situations where someone is being abused, they begin to internalize negative messages about themselves. They also begin to experience anxiety and depression, and then eventually and sometimes post-traumatic stress disorder. When that happens, life changes, right? Life perspective, emotions change, thought patterns change. When that happens, if that great-grandmother had children, depending on how much help she got or how much help she did not get, she can transfer her negative self-talk, her negative feelings, even some of the ways that she views her life, some of the ways that she views her life or views life in general, all of that can be transferred to the child. The child, depending on how much they've been affected, can then transfer that onto either other siblings in the family or to their own children or in their adult relationships in some fashion within that family. And so the trauma gets spread throughout generations. Now, if we're talking from a cultural perspective, we have to consider a history of marginalization and racial and discriminatory trauma for people of color, right? And so with that long history spanning from, slavery times, onward, right, even until today, that's a long, long history of cultural and racial trauma. And so it has psychological and emotional effects throughout generations. Okay, a lot of people regard intergenerational trauma as a family curse. I don't think they always know that they are regarding intergenerational trauma as a family curse, but that's basically what it is. All right, so the first sign that you may have a family history of intergenerational trauma is unresolved emotions and thoughts. And this is something that I talk about a lot on my YouTube channel and on my website and with clients in my office. Unresolved emotions and thoughts. If you have, again, a grandparent, a great uncle, or even your parents who have experienced trauma and it hasn't been resolved, more than likely they're going to pass on some kind of emotions or thought patterns onto the next generation. Unresolved family conflicts and secrets can also, as I listed above, can erode a family, right? It can tear a family apart. And I do provide an example for you. I have to give you a little bit of information on that. Having no understanding of trauma can lead to feelings of confusion and depression and just perplexity, right? Why is this happening in my family? Why don't we get along? Why does this seem to happen, whatever it may be, throughout generations? Why is this a pattern in my family? So those kind of unresolved thoughts, questions, those emotions can all lead to trauma or post-traumatic stress disorder. So the number one sign is unresolved emotions and thoughts. Repeated pattern of toxic beliefs. This is another important sign. Again, once trauma is passed down through generations, it causes a pattern within families. And of course, I know you're aware of this. That's why it's considered a family curse, because it's not something that's easily moved or easily resolved by trauma. By a trauma expert or a trauma therapist, or by therapy, right? Repeated patterns of toxic beliefs and behaviors and attitudes within the family becomes ingrained. It becomes rooted into who we are. And so because of that, you can't just, tell yourself, oh, stop thinking that way, right? You can't just tell yourself, I'm just going to go to therapy or counseling for a few sessions and I'll be good. It's going to take a long time, right? Intergenerational trauma is generational. And so your challenges are going to take a while to inspect and evaluate and identify as well and heal. Right? So I think a lot of clients that come in to see me for trauma counseling or trauma therapy, they think that they can come for a few sessions and get some validation and some tools and leave. And what they end up finding out is, oh my God, my mom is thinking a certain way, or my grandmother is thinking a certain way, and it's sending me backwards, right? It's causing me to regress in the little bit of progress I may have made in sessions. So trying to deal with those repeated patterns of toxic beliefs, behaviors, attitudes within a family, it's going to take some time to work through that. Okay, and I did provide in this slide a few examples of those toxic beliefs, right? Things that I've heard, and I've heard this mainly from kids, the quote at the bottom, nothing is wrong with marijuana, right? My entire family smokes it, right? Some people are psychologically addicted to marijuana, and although it's becoming more of a mainstream accepted thing, we have to keep in mind that there are neurological changes and damage that can result for adolescents whose brains aren't fully developed. So that's an issue when I hear a kid say to me, hey, nothing's wrong with marijuana. My entire family smokes it. I smoke it every day, all day. It doesn't matter. I get concerned. So that's one of those toxic family beliefs that, I don't really care what you do. Go in your room, smoke marijuana, drink alcohol. It's all good, right? That's a toxic belief. Another toxic belief that I listed here is my mother is a shaman healer, and that's a Native American healer, and believes that, I should never talk to anyone about my abuse history. That's another toxic belief, that you should keep everything within the community, within your family. Don't speak out, don't say anything, act like things never happened. Right? I'm sure you guys know a lot about that. You've experienced that. So this is just a slide of a couple of toxic beliefs that I have had to deal with many of my clients. All right, guys, 1 second here. I want to make sure that we're on track. So the next one and the next sign is untreated or poorly treated mental health and substance abuse problems. This is another issue throughout generations in families. A long history of poorly treated mental health or substance abuse problems can lead to unhealthy behavioral patterns and toxic beliefs that are spread throughout the family. So let me give you a little bit of an example. So I have seen multiple families over the past year who have dealt with intergenerational trauma. And one family that I just discharged had a lot of issue with the great aunt who had a very checkered past a lot of legal trouble, a lot of emotional and psychological challenges that were untreated. Borderline personality disorder was also a suspicion that the great aunt struggled with. So there was a repeated pattern of manipulation, a lot of depression, anxiety. There was also a lot of toxic belief patterns, physical and emotional abuse towards her own children. So there was a long, long history of untreated and poorly treated mental health and behavioral problems. That led to the raising of other kids in the family and the raising of her own children, because she had to take on other kids that had issues within the family. So she decided to raise them. But her untreated and poorly treated mental health and substance abuse problems led to generations of issues that were unresolved. The family had a lot of unresolved trauma, a lot of anger, a lot of pent-up emotions. And part of it was due to the fact that this great aunt would not stop drinking. She would not stop indulging in drugs. She would not see a psychotherapist or a psychiatrist. She had this biased belief about the mental health system that nobody could help, right? She had a few experiences and they turned her away. You can't blame her. We have a lot of issues in our field, but we also have a lot of skilled people as well. It takes some time to find them, and she didn't understand that. So what ended up happening to her is she ended up passing on so many problems to her kids and the other kids in the family that she raised. And so it was generations upon generations of issues as a result. One of the things I pointed out to the family is, look, until she gets help with substance abuse and until she opens her heart and mind to therapy, we're going to stay stuck. And that's exactly what happened. She dropped out of treatment, refused drug and alcohol treatment, and continue to emotionally and psychologically abuse her family. So if you're seeing this pattern within your family, just be aware that it's a long road. It's hard, it's discouraging, and you're most likely going to need your own counseling and support. So this is sign number 3, that you have a family with intergenerational trauma, that repeated pattern of untreated and poorly treated mental health and substance abuse issues. It's major. Okay, excuse me. Sign number 4, red flag number 4 is poor parent-child relationships. I have dealt with families, and I have within my own family, generations of individuals who have been raised under parents who were unhealthy. They were toxic. They were emotionally unavailable, psychologically immature, emotionally distant, and for a lack of a better word, just toxic, right? There was a lot of unresolved psychological and emotional issues, trauma. There was a lot of abuse within my family. With older generations in my family, there has been this repeated pattern of poor parent-child relationships, poor parenting styles, authoritarian, I call this the Hitler parenting style. And I call it that because there's just, love, affection, balance, warm embrace, understanding, and being able to relate is totally absent from the authoritarian parenting style. So I call it the Hitler parenting style. You may have seen this within your own family. I've seen it within my own family among older generations, and that is not good. It leads the children who have been raised under that to develop resentment and rage towards that parent and their own substance abuse and mental health challenges as well. So also neglectful parenting, right? You bring the child into the world, you may clothe it, you may feed the child, you may, do all those things, send them to school, but your heart is not in the right place, right? You don't really have a connection to the child. You're just raising the child because you have to, or you're gonna get caught by Child Protective Services. That's neglectful parenting. Permissive parenting, same thing. I think parents who are permissive, they love their kids, they just don't know how to raise them. They don't know how to be a parent. And so their parenting is often very inadequate and immature and just very distant and not very validating for the child. All of these things can lead to the child growing up to become very resentful and hateful, hurt, depressed, anxious, and even go after the wrong relationships, right? Or even develop their own poor parent-child relationship. So this is sign number 4, that you're dealing with a family history of intergenerational trauma, the poor parent-child relationships throughout generations. I actually, forgive me, on bullet point 2, I did not complete my sentence there. I'll explain that. But sign number 5 is complicated personality traits. Borderline personality disorder is a diagnosis that's steeped, as I put it on the slide, in family dynamics. An invalidating family dynamic is one that often leads to borderline personality disorder. Also, that back and forth, polarized, black and white kind of attitude, behavior, and thought patterns from parents can cause that borderline personality disorder. Borderline personality disorder, as I'm sure you're aware of, is both biological and environmental. So if you have the genetic makeup of one with borderline personality disorder, and your parents raise you a certain way, or they don't validate you, they don't show you love, or they're very flip-floppy or polarized in their love towards you, then borderline personality is likely to develop. Is likely to be developed. So with this kind of complicated personality trait, a lot of individuals with BPD, not all, but a lot, struggle with raising kids, because if they're not getting the appropriate treatment for themselves, they're likely struggling with unresolved mental health issues. People with borderline personality disorder are also often diagnosed with bipolar disorder or depression or anxiety, and that complicates it even further. So complicated personality traits throughout a family history can lead to a cascade or a host of challenges throughout the generation or the lifespan of the family. Individuals who are characterized as narcissistic or sociopathic, right, or dependent, those kind of things, histrionic. And I talk a lot about this on my blog at Psych Central. I have a blog there, and I talk a lot about these different characteristics, personality characteristics. Individuals who have these characteristics often complicate the family as well, because a narcissistic individual, as you know, could really care less about the emotional status of a child, right? So if they're raising you or trying to support you throughout childhood, or if they're grandparents, it's going to be really difficult to have that cemented, loving relationship with a narcissistic person. A sociopath, you know, they're very cold, very impersonal, very robotic in how they interact. Dependent and histrionic individuals, they struggle with emotion regulation, their perspective of life, things like that. Anybody that has complicated personality traits that could be characterized as a personality disorder, it's going to be difficult to live with them, right? So because of that, intergenerational trauma is likely to occur as well, especially if the individual is not getting treated. So let's keep moving. All right, so, we went backwards. All right, so the next one that I often see when I counsel families is the content attitude with the way things are. A lot of my families and individuals that I've talked to internationally, because I do consultations, so I talk with families overseas and throughout the nation, and there's a common theme I've noticed. After years and years of unresolved trauma and conflict and poor mental health and substance abuse issues and depression and negative beliefs about oneself, with all of this happening throughout the lifespan, or generation, I should say, a lot of people get depressed and they say, you know what, I'm done. I'm not trying this anymore. I'm not going to attempt to be better. I'm not going to push myself. I'm not going to force myself to do anything. I'm just going to remain where I'm at. And if that's on drugs, I'm going to do that. If that's depressed and unmotivated, I'm going to do that too. If that's, excuse me, dropping out of school, I'm sorry, I had to get water, excuse me. If that's dropping out of school, if that's giving up on life, I'm going to do that because I can't do it and I won't. And a lot of people fall into the trap of learned helplessness, right? They kind of resolve it within themselves that life is not going to be better for me. It never was good for my family throughout generations. So how am I going to be any different, right? And so they develop that learned helplessness. There are also some family members who display traumatic bonding or Stockholm syndrome, right? If they've had a parent who has abused them or neglected them, they may stand up for that parent or family member, even though they know deep down they need to get away, but they can't. And I talk a lot about this on my Psych-Central blog as well, traumatic bonding. It's a powerful phenomenon, and it's something that can also lead to learned helplessness. Learned helplessness is the theory that you kind of learn to be helpless, right? You've been faced with so many obstacles and so many barriers in your life that you give up. And you say, you know what, the heck with it, I'm done. And you kind of, you know, in quotation marks here, you can't see me, but in quotation marks, learn to be helpless. You give up. And so a lot of families who have dealt with intergenerational trauma, you will see patterns of a content attitude, right? I'm going to stay here and I'm fine with that. Fluid or broken down boundaries. This is red flag number 7. Families who have generations and generations of broken down communication and boundaries, there's likely a history of intergenerational trauma. Dad or grandpa or Uncle Bob, Uncle Tim, Uncle Kevin, they never communicated with me. They never openly communicated with me. I just felt tension between us. I just felt like they gave up on me or shut down. They shut the door on me. When I reached out for help, they told me they would not help me or could not help me. They haven't shown me love and affection in decades, right? You've probably heard that. You've probably experienced that. You've probably felt the same things. When that happens throughout generations, it continues, especially if no one stops the pattern. That's the problem with a family curse. The problem doesn't get stopped. It just continues because either the family can't see itself, right? They can't see that there's a problem, or there's no motivation to change it, or they don't have access to resources, right? That becomes an issue. And so this pattern throughout generations really does kind of keep you bound. One situation that I have right now with a family is the unfolding of family roles. And I listed them at the bottom. And let me go through these really briefly with you guys. I'll give you the definition. The family mascot, or the family clown, if you will, is the individual within the family who has basically found everything funny and humorous as a way to cope, right? Everything's a joke. Everything is covered up by humor, a smile, a laugh, a gesture, right? Or a serious moment or a serious conversation or situation is always turned into a joke. The family hero is the child who did everything correctly. They went to college, they graduated, they got married at the right time, they had kids at the right time, they, you know, went on to get like this really awesome job as a psychologist or a lawyer, right? That's the family hero. Then the lost child is the child who's the introverted, shy one who just goes over in the corner and just kind of watches everything. My younger brother is like that. And I think he is kind of introverted for reasons relating to the family, right? It's like, oh my God, we have a family full of anxious people. I'm getting out the way, right? So that's the lost child, someone who just kind of avoids the family drama, and they sit in the corner and just kind of observe. Those kind of kids, however, struggle because they don't know who they are, they don't know what they want to do, and they're afraid of doing anything and making the wrong decision. And then you've got the scapegoat within the family system or unit, and that's the child who's labeled and blamed, and they take the blame for everything that's wrong with the family. So within these roles, the situation I'm dealing with now with a client is she finds herself in all 4 of these roles. And what she's noticed is she's often placed within these roles or pushed into these roles because of broken down boundaries, right? Or fluid boundaries. They're always changing. They're too flexible. There's no concrete boundaries. One day the boundary line may be stay away from me, and the next day the boundary line is come over here, hug me, tell me, you know, that you love me, I'm your favorite aunt or cousin, right? So some people experience broken down and fluid boundaries when they are being placed within those family roles. Sometimes these individuals as well are wrongly categorized and abandoned, and that doesn't help as well. So if you see this without generations within your family, just know that this is often red flag number 7 as far as signs of intergenerational trauma. Emotionally detached and toxic parents. We talked a little bit about this at the beginning of the slide. The slideshow. We talked about this at the beginning. And I think it's important to keep in mind that emotionally detached and toxic parents often have had emotionally detached and toxic parents themselves. So again, keeping in mind that intergenerational trauma, if you have a mom or a dad who's detached and toxic, you have to be able to consider, well, wait a minute, was his mom or was his grandmother toxic? Where did his toxicity arise from? Is it rooted in a long history of intergenerational trauma? All right, take into consideration those parenting roles, that Hitler-like parenting role, that authoritarian, you know, was this parent of yours the victim of an authoritarian parent, of a neglectful parent, a permissive parent, right? Did they experience stonewalling? The whole idea that I come to you for an emotional response, or I come to you for a conversation and you totally stonewall me. You totally stop reacting. Gaslighting, right? Making you feel like you're crazy or you're not making any sense or you're all alone. And love bombing. Making you feel that they don't love you, and the next day telling you you are the most wonderful person in the world, right? If you see these patterns throughout generations, just know that there's probably some personality disorders going on there. There's probably some very poor parent-child relationships, and there's probably a lot of intergenerational trauma as well. All right, I just want to hit on a couple things here, and I know you guys probably can't see the bottom because of my status bar. I apologize. But let's just talk a little bit about the cultural implications of unresolved trauma throughout generations. So there's a lot of multi-ethnic people in the world. We have tons of beautiful cultures, but I'm just focusing on the major categories that research has focused on. And so within these families, African American families, Native American families, Latino families, Asian American families, they deal with a lot of unresolved intergenerational trauma for one common reason, right? Marginalization and racism. Studies suggest that there is a clear link between racism, marginalization, and post-traumatic stress disorder. If you have a great uncle and you're African American, or you have a great aunt who's Native American or Hispanic or Asian American, and they have experienced trauma or racism or marginalization because of the color of their skin or because of their social status in society, just know that they're probably dealing with long generation of cultural trauma, right? You're also, as the younger generation, most likely going to experience it as well, right? Because consider this, if you have a parent who has experienced racism and their parent has experienced it as well in generations past, most likely they have passed on a one-sided, polarized, unhealthy view of mainstream society because they've been so hurt. And so more than likely, they've passed down some views that aren't necessarily healthy or beneficial. And so that is intergenerational trauma playing out in and of itself, that one parent can say things to a child that's not correct, or they could say things in ways that are kind of polarized or biased just because they've been so hurt by marginalization, prejudice, and racism, that the child begins to also perpetuate those beliefs within the family. And so that gets passed on through generations, right? We have to also consider that a lot of African Americans live in the South, and the South, especially the Deep South, is where you deal with a lot of racism and marginalization, even in today's society. And so some research has focused on African Americans within the South and some of the cultural trauma that they have dealt with there. And unfortunately, it is intergenerational. It happened back in 1920-something. It happened back in the 1800s in the South, and it's continuing even to today. Native Americans, they also deal with intergenerational trauma from a cultural perspective. There's a lot of preconceived notions about the Native American heritage. I'm part Native American. I come from a multi-ethnic family, so a lot of this is personal for me, and I've seen that within my family history, just because we're so multi-ethnic, I've seen the cultural trauma throughout generations, and it is devastating, especially when emotions and belief systems become rigid and it's hard to break through and help them see things differently. So Native Americans have experienced that. They pass things down to their children. They're very spiritual and very interconnected with their family. And so they pass down to their children and younger generations the racism and the marginalization that they have experienced. And that can lead to trauma, just reliving the situation or listening to the stories. That can be traumatizing. Native Americans, African Americans as well, because they tend to be marginalized, you know, in the South or in segregated and rural areas or in tribes, they don't have access to mental health resources or substance abuse resources. And so the cultural trauma that they have experienced, they aren't able to deal with it or tend to it because of the simple fact that they don't have access to the therapists and the resources that they need to tackle that. So the trauma perpetuates because of that. Same thing for Asian Americans. They also, Asians, Koreans, and individuals who are from the Philippines, things like that, Hawaii, they sometimes come to the United States and they feel very marginalized and ousted because there's no historical diversity in the U.S. for their specific culture. There just isn't, right? Even you know, among African Americans and Native Americans and Hispanics, they seem to be the more dominant. A lot of my Asian clients say, well, I feel like I'm invisible because I don't see anybody who can relate to me in the United States who's Asian. So a lot of Koreans and Asians and Hawaiians and Filipinos, they come to the United States and they feel that they don't have that diversity here. They feel very marginalized and ousted. And so what you're going to get there is a lot of depression and anxiety and maybe just fear and phobias. You're also going to get older generations talking to the younger generations within the Asian culture about the racism and marginalization they experience. And so that gets perpetuated, throughout generations. And Hispanics living at or under the poverty line, they don't have the resources, again, to get that mental health and substance abuse treatment that they need. So whatever intergenerational trauma or intergenerational cultural trauma that they have experienced, they can't get the help they need because they don't have the access to help. This is just another slide. I won't go over this one just because we kind of talked about this throughout the presentation, but I do want to touch on the intrapsychic and the interpersonal challenges. When we're talking about people of color or ethnic minorities, there's a lot of intrapsychic and interpersonal challenges that are at play. Intrapsychic or internal negative messages about one's culture, about oneself, can often lead to a negative self-concept. It can also lead to the act of kind of marginalizing oneself, right? Isolating and withdrawing from society. The interpersonal challenges, not being able to relate to other people, feeling like there's no diversity within their communities and within their neighborhoods, schools, workplaces, all of that stuff, again, can lead to trauma and trauma responses and post-traumatic stress disorder. Years and years of complicated cultural intergenerational trauma that has not been resolved is a problem. So let's just briefly switch gears so we can stay on track here. Let's just briefly talk about post-traumatic growth. So post-traumatic growth is basically the idea that you have experienced a trauma. And even though that trauma may not have been 100% resolved, you can walk away from that trauma knowing that you have gained something, knowing that your future can be better than your past. That's basically what post-traumatic growth is, that your future and your present moment can be better than your past, that you have derived some kind of meaning that actually means something from that traumatic experience, right? It's experiencing the consolidation. I call it the consolidation of traumatic memories, right? You may have memories of something bad happening. You may have memories of a family member telling you of terrible trauma within your history, but you can kind of consolidate those traumatic memories with healing. You can kind of accept those memories. You can accept that trauma and integrate it within your current position in your life. That's what I mean by consolidation of traumatic memories, right? So that's basically post-traumatic growth. It's not easy to push yourself into post-traumatic growth. I really do think that you need to come to emotional and psychological maturity, and you also need to go to counseling to obtain that knowledge and that emotional growth and psychological healing that you need before you can experience that post-traumatic growth. A lot of my clients regard post-traumatic growth as the light bulb moment, right? It's that moment where you say, wait a minute, it all makes sense and I'm okay with it. I can sit with this and I can be okay. There's a lot of misconceptions, however, about post-traumatic growth. A lot of people think that I don't need to experience the 5 stages of grief, or if I did experience stages of grief, I really don't need to re-experience it, and I'm most likely healed forever, right? That's a misconception. You may experience post-traumatic growth, and you may experience a light bulb moment. You may heal, but there's also a possibility that you may not heal. There's also a possibility that you might experience stages of grief and then find yourself returning to them at a later time, right? So the way that I want to encourage you to view post-traumatic growth is by understanding that you may experience that growth, yes, but you may also regress. There may be times in your life where you may feel like, wait a minute, I thought I developed, I thought I grew, I thought I changed, right? That's okay. Post-traumatic growth is not this stage of arrival. It's a stage of healing where you say, I can accept this, right? So there's a lot of misconceptions about post-traumatic growth, and I want to encourage you to continually remind yourself that even if I experience that growth, I can very well regress. I can very much experience this pain all over again. And that doesn't mean that I'm stuck. It doesn't mean that I can't change or I can't feel anything different. It means that this is just where I'm at this time, and I need to continue to work to feel better. Helpful books. I love Bonded to the Abuser. I actually used to do professional book reviews for Psych Central for like years. And I reviewed this book for Psych Central, Bonded to the Abuser, and I think it's a powerful book. You can probably search for my book review through Psych Central if you'd like. I encourage you to get the book. It's fantastic. It talks a lot about traumatic bonding and how to heal from that trauma. And I also encourage a classic by Viktor Frankl, and that's Man's Search for Meaning. It's an awesome book. It kind of gives you a perspective of what post-traumatic growth is. It shows you everything he's gone through, and yet at the end of that tunnel, he was able to turn around and say, you know what, that's okay, I accept that, and here's where I can grow from it. So I encourage you to get those 2 books. All right, so I added some resources for you to continue to grow and develop and research this topic. I also added a couple things where you can find me as well. If you're interested in reaching out to me, or you have questions, or you want to learn a little bit more about this topic, you can definitely reach out to me through any of my social media channels. And I also have a book that came out May 2018. This is my 2nd book. It's specifically written for parents and teachers, but you can also find some interesting tools in there for yourself as an adult. What I like about chapter 2 and 3 of this book is that I talk a lot about the cultural implications of trauma and suicide, and I talk a lot about suicide contagion and how one individual within a family unit can commit suicide and, for lack of a better word, kind of encourage other family members to do the same. So almost like a suicide pact. So I talk a lot about that in this book as well. So I encourage you to get that. Thank you so much, guys, for being with me today. And thank you so much, Psych Central and Gabe, for allowing me to do this webinar. I hope it's helpful.
Well, we really appreciate you. Thank you for being here. So, as of this moment, there are no questions, but I always like to wait a few moments before we disconnect just in case any pop in. We really appreciate you doing
Yeah.
this. Thank you so much.
Thank you, Dave. Thank you.
You're welcome. While we're waiting to see if there's any questions, can you give us your website just one more time,
Yeah,
please? And also the name of your blog on Psych Central for folks to find.
absolutely. So my website is anchoredinKnowledge.com, and that's ANCHOREDIN knowledge.com. You can find me there and all my social media channels. And then my blog for Psych Central, I love writing for you guys. It is blog.psychcentral.com, and then it's /caregivers.
Wonderful. Thank you so much. We'll give it another few seconds. Are there any last words? There's not always questions. I like to tell presenters that's when there's no questions, it just means that you answered them all in your very thorough presentation.
I love that. I love that. That's awesome. I will give a comment just to wrap this up. That firstly, thank you once again. I want to thank you for that. And Gabe,
It's
you're
our
awesome.
pleasure.
I want to say this, that the intergenerational trauma is really hard to wrap your mind around. So if you find yourself kind of feeling like you're in the middle of an ocean, you can't figure out where it started and how it's going to end, don't feel alone. There are mental health professionals who study this for a living. I'm one of them. There are trauma therapists who are extraordinarily compassionate and experienced. And so you can find them. It might take some time, but don't give up. I think counseling for intergenerational trauma can be very healing. So I will leave it at that.
Wonderful. Thank you so much, and thank you everybody for tuning in, and we will see you next week.
Thank you.
Thank you. I'm sorry, I
Thanks
apologize.
so much.
Next month. Thank you.
Awesome. Thank you, guys.